My name's Quinn. I'm a cloud economist. I've spent the past year as a consultant focusing on exactly one problem. I fixed the horrifying AWS bill. Now that I'm closing that consultancy down and becoming gainfully unemployed, I figured it'd be a good time to tell a story about what I've been up to. You'll notice my Twitter handle is on all of my slides. I've been live tweeting a number of talks over the last couple of days, including this one. So if you want to see the director's cut, you know where to go. So let's start with a quick poll here. Who here identifies as an engineer? Almost everyone. Who here is management? Who here works in finance? A couple people. Yeah. We'll allow it. Who here cares about the AWS bill? Who here cares about the AWS bill because your boss cares about the AWS bill? So it's been an interesting place to play in. Not a lot of consultants I've met speak specifically to this space, so it leads to interesting stories. Let's go ahead and start with one. Has this ever happened to you? You build a wildly successful company that goes beyond the hopes and dreams even your most aggressive investors could possibly have had. The business people are happy, the engineers are happy, and then one day, something a lot less happy happens. It seems that the CFO has lodged a formal complaint against you with HR, and they'd like a word. Right now, the conference organizers are wondering if they're about to have to issue an apology for what's on the next slide. So you're about as nervous as they are. It seems that you've been sending your phone number to everyone in finance, and that definitely crosses some lines. Whew, you're relieved, the organizers are relieved, because you can explain this away. You weren't sending your phone number out to people. That was just this month's Amazon bill. Huh? Strangely, the CFO is not happy with this. He or she has had quite a shock. And it takes a minute or two to get over it, at which point they generally stammer something along the lines of, so engineering spent, Jesus Christ, at Amazon last month? How the hell many books are they buying? And now that I think about it, I don't see them reading all that much. The problem here comes down to communication, like so many things in the SRE world. It's a level of communication separation that makes the divide between dev and ops look a little bit adorable. Engineering and finance are completely talking past each other in many of these cases. It's not even remotely the same language. It's like trying to mash up pop culture with surrealist artwork. At the absolute best, you're talking about the same thing terribly. More to the point, the person who winds up getting the $20,000 bill for a cluster is 5 organizational levels removed from the person who's spinning that cluster up. As a direct result, this turns into a void between engineering and finance. It's impermeable from either side. Because while we all talk about people doing the operations work, working together with other groups, finance is rarely one of those groups that people consider having to work with. Now, I've sat through a lot of interesting sales pitches from the usual suspects who play in these space. Cloudability, Cloud Checker, Cloud9, Cloud Conformity, Cloud Health, Cloud Belt Sander, Cloud etc. They all are effectively the same, and they do presentations on how to control costs in AWS. And it's the same sales pitch every time, to the point where I can almost quote it chapter and verse. In fact, I turned it into just a single enterprise-grade slide with a wall of text that covers most of these salient points. With this many words on a single slide, I expect there's a job offer pending from IBM just by putting this up here. It's riveting. Tell your friends. These are a few of the 85 weird tricks that Jeff Bezos doesn't want you to know. Your AWS account rep hates me. Number 8 will blow your feet off. Yeah. This isn't interesting. It's not new, and I'm not adding a whole lot of value with this slide. We'll come back to it later and talk about it, but this is the sort of stuff you can all do programmatically for the most part. And once again, just for fun, put your hand up again if you identify as an engineer. Yeah, everyone with your hand raised right now, you are probably a terrible customer for what I've been up to lately. And again, there's a cultural point of relevance here. I live in San Francisco. This may not transcend outside the ridiculous bubble that I call home. But when I talk to an engineer, it's like trying to sell to Hacker News. I can talk for 90 minutes straight about everything they can do to adjust their environment to make it more cost efficient, and at the end of it, I always get the same response. Well, that doesn't sound hard. I could do that in a weekend. Right. So the trick is, though, is that's not really what I tend to look at this from a perspective of. Instead of tooling and cutting the cost, there's something else that's more interesting to talk about. There's a lot of different ways you can trim actual dollars and cents from your Amazon bill. But the honest truth is that no one cares in the business sense. Almost no one cares what the cloud bill is. Now, they're going to tell you that they care, and they're going to be very adamant that they care, because they're going to believe that they care. They think that's the position that they're coming from, but it very rarely is. Now, you don't have to believe me, but after a number of conversations with different companies, I've sort of scratched beyond the surface of make the number smaller and gotten into the real questions that companies actually care about and think about. If you have a failed project that took 6 months of time, they know how much that cost in terms of salaries and maybe opportunity cost, but what was the infrastructure cost tied to that project? They're going to take a write-down on it. They need a number. What percentage of our bill right now is R&D? This is an example of the language barrier, where we would talk about dev and staging. They're going to talk about R&D, which, by the way, includes engineering salaries. If instead of production, they call it cost of goods sold, or COGS. If you don't speak that language, it looks like they're making things up blatantly. Spoiler, that goes both ways. It gets at more interesting, longer-term questions, such as the big questions of the company, which is, are we making money or losing it? How do we wind up building financial models that start to address these things? If each new user costs you $8 to service, and they pay you $6, there's a longer-term problem here, except for the fact that I live in San Francisco, where that's not a problem because normal rules of business and profit and loss don't even slightly apply. It's all funny money. So yeah, if you're in San Francisco, forget I said anything. And the problem, of course, is that this is how the billing dashboard by default displays your spend breakdown. And being able to say that 30% of your bill is S3, that's great, awesome. And it speaks to none of the questions the business cares about. It's like they ask a question about what's coming up next quarter, and you start ranting about tabs versus spaces. They don't care. They don't think of it in that sense, and they write off whatever you say next. So if coming up with a bunch of tooling and quick fixes doesn't solve the problem, then what does? How do you start to address these things? In technical terms, this generally starts with a massive approach of putting tags on absolutely anything that holds still long enough. Generally, you can start tagging a lot of resources as you go through it and look at how you're doing things, and you start to figure out what tags matter. And once you have a resource tagged and you've defined it in AWS, you can identify that as a cost allocation tag, and then it shows up in a bunch of business reports. This starts to let you slice and dice either with their tools or with any other analysis system you have that makes sense. Believe me, your finance people love this. And they can start carving it apart and to start addressing the questions at a rough level that they've got. An example here is that if anyone's ever looked into their DBR, it's generally a CSV file that in larger environments is tens of gigabytes. And if you hand something like that to someone in finance, their response is, ooh, it's an Excel file. Why did Excel just scream itself to death? And no one's happy with that. There's a blog post on this that they posted on using Redshift with QuickSight to analyze your DBR for finance purposes. And it's a 25-step process, at which point you're looking through this and realizing, OK, so now I tell my finance person to install a database client and start querying it in SQL. Yeah, if I pitch that to the CFO, I'm getting fired. I mean, how many people have a finance team where they work that employs a data science team? Anyone? Yeah, a couple people. I'm willing to bet I know where you work. The challenge is, oh, just apply a whole bunch of other services and resources to solving this problem starts to rub the wrong direction. You want to start thinking about this stuff, though, even if people aren't asking you these questions today. And you want to start asking fun questions about individual resources. Is that resource a dev resource, or is it a production resource? Yes, those shoes are a metaphor. And it gets further into who built a given resource. Either in a grand sense, by the department and more usefully as an individual. It's easier to ask Julie if you still need those 2 petabytes of data that are hanging around in S3 than it is to ask the entire 600-person team that she's a part of individually, because everyone is going to have no idea what's going on. Wait, that team knows nothing about it? Huh, that's an awful lot of money to waste. What department even needed 2,000 copies of the same thing? Okay, that's a big open, unended question. As you go through the initial analysis project, you start adding things like that to the list. And things wind up getting surfaced. Like, oh, it was for Project Drunken Pony. Why didn't someone tell me that? We should have a project tag for that. We don't have anything approaching that. That's a different way of looking at this, and so on and so forth. As you go through a project like this, it starts to turn into a bit of a discovery experience where you learn things that you didn't know, and in some cases, wish you still didn't. You used to have to fit all of these things into 10 tags per resource. It was a hard limit. Last August, that was raised to 50, which means you can now get a lot closer to implementing a really terrible CMDB system just with Amazon tagging. But in order to do this effectively, you now get to figure out what things your company cares about. So the trick is simply to build a tagging strategy that works. It's trivial to do and left as an exercise for the reader, much like just write perfect code the first time and you don't have to worry about things like testing. It's never just that easy, and it's going to vary depending upon the specifics of what your company does, how your company operates, and what your company values. And to get to those answers, you're gonna have to talk to people in finance, because they're gonna be asked questions themselves, and in turn, they're going to ask questions 6 months down the road. And you don't know what those questions are going to be, and neither do they. And they're gonna have some ideas that will get you thinking down different paths. And you get to work together to find out what this looks like and revisit it periodically as times progress. In keeping with the theme of a lot of talks that we've seen over the last couple of days, it comes down to empathy and working cross-departmentally to start solving larger problems. This is what leads to the type of talk that we saw from Agilent, where they're building a business case for doing things a certain way. This is the language that large companies tend to speak. And as a fun fact, as you start assigning these tags to things, either manually or programmatically, you're going to find a really interesting side effect that you might not have expected, is that you're going to save a boatload of money as you do it. Because you're going to find resources that weren't necessarily being used and realize, if no one's responsible for it, why do we have it? Why don't we just kill it? It's like garbage collection for your AWS account. It's really kind of awesome. And this is kind of a unicorn in that it's a maintenance operational task that pays for itself. You don't usually see this. In fact, people start referring to it as that cost-saving project, even though that's not what it is or the value it delivers. What it is, effectively, is an analytics exercise from a budget perspective. And from a culture perspective, let me tell you from personal experience, it is normal to feel a bit bad as you do it the first time. In my last job, when I ran an SRE team, I was told that one of my tasks was to go ahead and save money. Of course, I didn't care, my boss did, from the earlier question. And I don't mean to brag here, but I saved a shitload of money. And now it's 18 months later, and looking back, I left a lot of money on the table. There's always more money that you can wind up saving. There's always ways to optimize further. And it wasn't because I was terrible at what I did, but it's that this is deep, complex, and past a certain point, it stops being a business priority. It also changes all the time. So the trick is here, just like a postmortem, is to keep it blameless. Because no one starts out building a project from the perspective, well, first thing, we need to make sure it's cheap. You're not testing things out from a costing perspective. It's something you care about later. You bolt on cost control at the end, just like security. No one starts out and cares about that, and I'd argue they shouldn't. No one wants to put up walls so that a hideously expensive developer has to worry about getting permission to spin up a $20 resource. And that's okay. The point here is to safeguard your culture. You don't want to make people's lives harder in the name of saving money. Well, back when we were in bare metal data centers, it took us 6 weeks to go ahead and spin up resources. So we're going to go ahead now and cut that down to 3 weeks to spin up AWS resources. Yeah, you can carry terrible products forward into new spheres, but it doesn't help anything. It makes it worse. And as a number of companies have found to their detriment that you could do this with physical resources, but you can do it with cloud providers too. If you throw up a bunch of roadblocks and make it difficult for people to do work, they're going to find a different provider to work around your controls and get their work done. That salient point helpfully brought to you by Microsoft Azure. Sorry, that's enough Microsoft jokes. I'll give it a rest after this one. So, story time. I once sold a project on the concept of on-demand spin-up and spin-down of development environments via almost a chat ops approach, where every Monday you get a bot in Slack or HipChat or IRC, God help you, that asks you whether or not, okay, your development cluster is costing $10,000 a month. Are you still using it? Click yes or no. If you click yes, it goes away for a week. If you click no, it turns it off, and if you ignore it, it kills it 2 days later. Sort of a positive pressure system to help keep costs low. They really liked it because effectively it's clippy for Slack, and it nags you about your Amazon spend. It's not as bad as I'm making it sound with that horrible thing on the screen, but they thought this was great, and they desperately wanted it because their development costs were through the roof. So, okay, I'll come in, and I'll definitely go ahead and implement this for you, but first, let's do an assessment and see what you're actually spending. So they hire me, and I do an assessment, and I find 2 things. The first was that their development spend was 3% of their bill. Now, at their scale, it was not a small amount of money. It was more than most people here make in a year. But in the context of the larger bill, is this the best place to start cutting? It's worth optimizing, sure, but maybe there's something that's easier, which got me to the second point. They didn't have any reserved instances purchased. Everything was priced on demand, which means that you could effectively save 20% off the top without bothering anyone who's ever touching a single thing at all. That's basically 5 clicks. So yeah, how about you do that first before you start disrupting everyone's workflow and writing a bunch of code that you're then going to have to maintain? I mean, it helps to pay attention before you start cutting away at things to understand where it's going in a comprehensive sense. Because if you don't know where your money's going, and spoiler, you probably don't, it gets away from you in weird directions that you don't see, find out. I mean, as a culture and as an industry, we whine obsessively about being data-driven to the point where people use that to make fun of us. So it's time for that trope to shine. This is your moment. And part of it also comes down to judgment and understanding other people's perspectives. One of the worst parts of my month is right now, the beginning of the month. Because that's when the nutters come out of the woodwork. Because that's when the AWS bills arrive. And it starts polluting all of my Twitter searches for relevant AWS content that I want to look into. And it's full of a bunch of comments like, I'm on the free tier, and I just got charged $7. This is an outrage. How and why did this happen? I'm a student. Now, them not knowing what they are doing isn't the poor judgment in any sense here. Because to a student, $7 is a lot. I mean, ramen is pricey. And no, the poor judgment I'm talking about is my own, in that originally I assumed that $7 wasn't significant, and who's going to care about that? I live in San Francisco. I spend more than that on toast, apparently. Who am I to tell anyone how much money is significant or not before I've had a conversation and understood their constraints? In one of my previous employers, if we're spending $20,000 a month on something, that was a huge pile of money. If I talk to Microsoft or Google about that, they start laughing hysterically. I mean, everything's relative, but understanding the constraints here. In fact, once, on my own account, I chased down a 20-cent variance. It took me 2 hours to do it, and it made sense. Because by understanding that, it later enabled me to save $80,000 a month based upon a use case I didn't fully understand. It was important to do this. And that's why going deep on these things is and is going to continue to be something of a human problem. I don't see a world in which we're going to be able to effectively provide platform tools or SaaS offerings with enough context to start intelligently making these decisions for us. That's why you can't just pay a service to make this all go away. It's also why you can't take it just as, I'm going to start writing some code and implement away. Again, I come from startup life, where the idea is that everyone in here codes, and there's a coding whiteboard interview for everyone who comes aboard, and they spend 2.5 years wondering why they can't hire an accountant. So the problem here is that you wind up, okay, let's say that you do that. You find a bunch of money in low-hanging fruit and knock it off the bill, and there we go. We're done. Back to my real job. And 3 months later, you're having the same conversation. And it becomes time to knock more money off the bill, and you wind up in this familiar situation where someone like me gets brought in. Generally, my buyer has never been on the engineering side. It's been someone in finance because the CFO has a problem. Namely, they see a giant pile of money going to that bookstore every month, and they're kind of concerned. So they ask their engineering team, and the response is, yup, we're optimized. Okay, the money's continuing to climb, and they finally put their foot down and say, okay, we're not approving any more spend on AWS above this threshold until certain revenue targets are hit. And then the next day, engineering knocks 50 grand off the monthly bill. Huh, so all I have to do now is threaten them? Okay, and this leads into a really strange environment because you, at the beginning, yeah, you can find the easy to cut stuff that you've just forgotten about and hadn't gotten to. But past a certain point, you want to start having a rhyme and reason and numbers to back this stuff up. Otherwise, it's, well, I can't talk to the people in engineering because we're speaking in 3 different languages. How do I go ahead and control this other than arbitrarily? And that's no fun for anyone. So in conclusion, as a business unit, the 3 things you want to do are have a plan, you want to understand where your money's going, and you want to be able to allocate that money intelligently. Now, that said, I am talking to engineers. So some of you are probably going to want to talk a little bit about how to actually go ahead and save dollars and cents money off of various Amazon bills, rather than, and here's how you talk to people in finance. In many cases, that turns into a managerial function. It's not something that many of us are going to do on a day-to-day sense. So let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit. Generally, when you take a look at actual saving real money and opportunities to save cost, I tend to break them into 3 buckets, easy, medium, and hard. The easy stuff is the thing that every platform system out there can do for you. It's, you should buy reserved instances. I'm going to look at your spend to see what you're doing. It's, go ahead and purchase this many in these regions for this duration. Great. There's no mystery or magic behind that. You wind up with other opportunities such as, hey, there's nothing running on that system. How about resizing it? And this is great, but even there, context starts to bite you. You have all these idle systems. Go ahead and turn them off. Yeah, look at their names. They're all called things like DR site and VPN failover, things where you want to be able to have them up and ready to go. An uncomfortable thing that people have observed is that during particular outages in US East 1, other regions stay up, but provisioning resources for certain services gets really tricky. You don't want to find out in the middle of a disaster that's going to be a problem, so it doesn't make economic sense to spin that stuff down given the sheer cost of downtime. So, okay, that's the easy stuff. Medium is where it starts to get a little more interesting. And that's where a lot of this stuff comes into play. Some of this stuff can be calculated programmatically. Some of it winds up requiring a little more insight into what you're doing. But it does wind up offering a bunch of opportunities here. For example, the idea of breaking things apart into Lambda functions that takes a bit of work, but if you have a cron job running all the time on a system and that's all it does once a day, maybe you can kill that, replace it with Lambda. Now, economically, Lambda and other serverless offerings are a lot more expensive per compute unit per hour than running an actual instance. But generally speaking, for most workloads, when they spin up and they run for 300 milliseconds or whatnot and then die, you don't see the kind of duty cycle that starts to kick that into the expensive tier. I have never yet found a bill where Lambda was an appreciable percentage of it. It's never been the sort of thing that has been rife for optimization. Unused elastic IPs, for example, if they're not attached to something, they cost you $1 a month. Generally doesn't matter until you find the account that has 500 or 700 of them sitting around doing nothing. It's, what are you doing? It becomes a bit of an interesting challenge there. As instances tend to evolve and get new versions come out, they're less expensive. They tend to be a lot more cost-effective for more power. They sometimes have flaky issues, so it definitely helps to reach out to people you know and not be the guinea pig for something that just got released this morning. Let other people stumble into that bear trap. But it pays to pay attention to these things. And OK, now that people are no longer screaming on DevOps or SRE Twitter about this stuff, now we can go ahead and calm down a little bit and maybe start migrating over there. There's other stuff that's not as intuitive. For example, if you have a bunch of provisioned IOPS volumes for EBS, great. Those tend to be extremely fast and extremely expensive. IOPS scale linearly on general purpose volumes, so if you make it bigger, Sure, it's 5 times as the size that you need, but you have a same performance profile for less than 1/3 of the cost in some cases. Maybe it makes sense to go ahead and do that, depending upon your workload. S3 also has a bunch of different opportunities. They had a service class called reduced redundancy storage for a long time. They still do. Anyone ever use it for anything? Anyone still using it for something? OK. It still exists. The idea is instead of the 11 nines, whatever ridiculous number they claim for durability, they say only 3 nines. So if you don't really care about it, it's less expensive. They don't advertise it, but it still exists, and you can still use it. But it no longer participates in price cuts, which means you're paying for the shitty storage more money than you would be for the normal good storage that everyone understands. So maybe stop doing that. Another S3 example that caught me out. A client had 3 terabytes of data sitting in an S3 bucket, which was cool. And they were being billed for 40 terabytes, which wasn't cool. Let's figure out why. Turned out that broken multi-part uploads, if it doesn't complete successfully, you can't list the objects, but they hang out there forever and you get billed for them. So it was a 2-step fix. Step 1, turn on a lifecycle policy that blows away any multi-part objects after a week to get rid of this stuff. And 2, you've got 37 terabytes there. This isn't a person sitting there clicking a button all the time. There's some broken code. Find it and fix it. So finding things like that starts to wind up providing opportunities. Go diving into your bill a fair bit and see what's there. This one starts to get into the hard bucket, which I'll get to in a second. But data transfer does a lot of interesting things, and it's not very well understood. As part of the Open Guide, I helped build this chart that tracks down what it costs to move data around. Well, actually, it's very simple. Yeah, after I put this version up, 2 people found bugs in it. It's great. We're continuing to iterate forward on this. This stuff is hard. There are pull requests available. I'll get to that link in a little bit, but we'll get there. I mean, there's a lot of other opportunities, too. Understanding the constraints and use cases of the environment becomes tremendously important. It may seem counterintuitive, but it doesn't hurt to reach out to Amazon as well and get their opinion on these things. One of the reasons I got into cost control specifically was that there is no one on the other side of this issue. By which I mean, even Amazon doesn't want the narrative to become, yeah, well, I really like the AWS service, except for the part where it's pants-shittingly expensive. Great. People want the service to be used judiciously, and they want the stories to be good. There's no one there rooting for waste. It's like a hurricane. There's usually not someone on the other side of that issue. I'm going to go back there to a little bit and leave that up as well. And have looked. So other questions. What questions do people have about? Sorry, we'll get there in a second, but I should touch the third bucket first. Sorry, can you tell I'm on jet lag here? The third, of course, is the hard bucket. That's at a significant scale. Once you've blown past the relatively minor things and you're spending millions or tens of millions a year, it's unlikely you're going to find a whole lot of low-hanging fruit that moves the needle. Well, it turns out that we left 5 petabytes hanging out in S3 and then transferring it back and forth 5 times a day. Turns out that's really expensive. Here you go. I just saved you $8 million. Yeah, that doesn't usually happen. At that scale, you're getting into the point where the only thing that is going to cause significant cost reduction starts to look like architecture changes. And in most cases, you're not going to find that changing your architecture, rewriting your applications and changing your architecture for cost reasons is going to make a tremendous amount of sense. But it does start to make sense when you're already in the process of having a conversation that looks like, well, the thing's written in PHP, it's 20 years old, and it's a horrifying monolith that no one understands. We're thinking about rewriting it. That's the time where it at least makes sense to look at it from a costing perspective. You can start architecting in ways that take advantage of the underlying platform that don't break the bank. Now, it's almost never going to make sense to re-architect just for costing. In the entire time I've been doing this, I have never yet found a company that went out of business because the cloud bill was too high. The closest you get is that they don't have a business model and it costs money to service users. I don't know how to fix that one.